This is the first PowerPoint presentation for Week 4 of History 213, and it covers the Jefferson and Madison administrations. The next few slides describe Thomas Jefferson. This first slide looks at the beginning of his administration. The next slide gives biographical information on Thomas Jefferson. This slide looks at Thomas Jefferson's relationship with the beginning of the Library of Congress. Jefferson was part of the gentry class, and though the title of gentleman as an official title was no longer used, the attitude remained. Thomas Jefferson is in fact a controversial figure because he is highly valued for his contributions to the founding of the country, and on the other hand, his frankly hypocrisy in holding and maintaining slaves. He owned about 600 slaves over the course of his life, and at any one time at least 200. The controversial issue of his relationship with Sally Hemings looks to be more and more conclusive. This slide continues the discussion of Jefferson and slavery. In his inaugural address, Jefferson stated, "We are all Republicans, we are all Federalists," a conciliatory statement he hoped would help end any animosity towards himself or his party. The election of 1800 between Adams and Jefferson, in which Jefferson was elected president, ushered in a new era of American political history. As it stood under the first two presidents, the well-to-do dominated the political scene, that is, under Washington and Adams. But with the emergence of Jefferson, a more democratic political system would now take shape. More men of different social and economic backgrounds, so long as they were white, could more effectively participate. Adams, stubborn as he was, refused to attend Jefferson's inauguration, and for 12 years following, neither one would speak to the other. Just before leaving office, Adams signed the Judiciary Act of 1801. Strategically reducing the size of the Supreme Court from 6 justices to 5 and eliminating the justices' circuit duties. The act was his last Federalist stand. You'll see also some other things he did there at the last minute before Jefferson took office, and Adams was trying to shore up the position of the Federalists before Jefferson, with his Republican views in opposition to certain Federalist views, took office. These appointments that Adams made at the last minute led to the Supreme Court case of Marbury versus Madison in 1803, that is, during Jefferson's administration. As one of his final acts prior to leaving office, Adams had named William Marbury as the new Justice of the Peace in Washington. Yet, he had been unable to deliver the commission letter before vacating the Capitol. Under Jefferson, James Madison filled the vacant office of Secretary of State and was immediately informed by the President not to deliver the appointed letter. That's President Jefferson. Marbury, feeling obligated to the position, sued Madison and demanded a writ of mandamus, an order requiring Madison to deliver the order. The Supreme Court's decision, was unanimous, though on the matter, Chief Justice John Marshall concluding that Marbury had a right to the job, but that the court could provide no legal means of obtaining it for him, as they had no jurisdiction to hear the case. Previously, The Judiciary Act of 1789 had provided the court original jurisdiction over cases concerning writs of mandamus, but the Marshall Court declared that act unconstitutional, and thus they had no jurisdiction in Marbury's case. What is significant here is not so much the decision delivered in the case specifically of Marbury, but that what had actually gone on to get to that decision. This decision established the court's power of judicial review. That is, the Supreme Court determining whether a law passed by Congress is constitutional. This power was seen dramatically recently, wherein much of the Obama health care law was found to be constitutional by the Supreme Court. Chief Justice Roberts noting the constitutional rationale for the law. Another issue that Jefferson had to deal with during his presidency was the concern over the Barbary Pirates. When Jefferson took the presidency, he sought to force the government to live within its means. Unlike Hamiltonian economics, which rested on a national debt, Jefferson promised that the government would be both wise and frugal. For Jefferson, the best way to secure this frugality, while also remaining true to his small government philosophy, was to strip down both the standing army and the navy. Conflict in the Mediterranean, however, with the Barbary pirates would force him to reconsider the size of his navy. It should be noted at this point that Alexander Hamilton died in a duel with the sitting Vice President Aaron Burr in 1804. There were in total 4 Barbary states on the coast of North Africa, all of which engaged in piracy and demanded tributes from weaker nations for protection. At the end of the American Revolution, American vessels became the target of these pirates, and under both Washington's and Adams' administration, the government paid them tribute, first to Morocco in 1786 and then to the others in the 1790s. For no longer protected by the British, the American Navy was too weak to defend itself. Here's a map showing the origin of those pirates. As president, Jefferson decided to continue the payments, but in the same year as his inauguration, the leader or Pasha of Tripoli demanded more tribute money and symbolically declared war on the U.S. by chopping down the American flag at the U.S. consulate. In response, Jefferson sent warships as a blockade against Tripoli, which resulted in a war which lasted until 1805. Before moving on to the Louisiana Purchase, let's take a quick look at the man who would be the Secretary of the Treasury for Jefferson and much of Madison's administration. Because of similar Republican views, and noting, as many had, Gallatin's financial strengths, Jefferson chose Albert Gallatin as his Secretary of the Treasury. Albert Gallatin is that person we've been following since he came to the U.S. as a young man. Gallatin was a first-hand product of the French Enlightenment, growing up at the knee of Voltaire. He was also a financial genius. Gallatin would serve through both terms of Jefferson's administration and then over 4 more years in the following Madison administration. In fact, Gallatin served longer at this position than anyone else in the history of the U.S. Because of their similar political views, their dedication to Enlightenment principles, and their congeniality with each other, Jefferson, Madison, and Gallatin formed what has now come to be known as the Jeffersonian Triumvirate. What separated Gallatin from the other two was his adamant and lifelong stance against slavery. And now the important Louisiana Purchase, which occurred during Jefferson's first administration. As war waged with the Barbary pirates, Jefferson caught wind of events taking place in France, which ultimately led to the Louisiana Purchase of 1803, a land acquisition which more than doubled the size of the country. And then the next point gives you the background for the area that would become the Louisiana Purchase. By 1801, news of the deal reached Jefferson, who feared that if Napoleon physically took control of the Mississippi outlet, and New Orleans, then he must marry himself to the British fleet, for his own navy could not stop that of Napoleon's. Addressing the issue, Jefferson sent Minister of France Robert Livingston to negotiate a trade. Negotiations with France dragged on with no real end, and by 1803 Jefferson sent James Monroe to France to help with negotiations. An agreement was made on April 30th, 1803. Albert Gallatin, the Secretary of the Treasury, was able to find the money for the purchase without raising any taxes or going into debt. And not much later, he accomplished the same thing with regard to the Lewis and Clark expedition. Known as the Noble Bargain, the purchase succeeded in accomplishing two things. First, it created a new empire of liberty, but also presented Jefferson with a constitutional dilemma. As a strict constructionist, Jefferson had to come to the realization that nowhere in the Constitution was the president the right to purchase territory. In the end, Jefferson relented on his dilemma and accepted, if only half-heartedly, that the power was implied and was found in the president's right to make treaties. Thus, the treaty was ratified in 1803, late 1803. The acquisition of the Louisiana Territory provided the United States a wealth of land yet to be explored. As an amateur scientist deeply interested in the flora and fauna of the West, Jefferson asked Congress for $2,500 to send out an expedition to both map and explore this new land. Leading the expedition was 29-year-old Meriwether Lewis, the president's private secretary, and another Virginian named William Clark, a younger brother of Revolutionary War General George Rogers Clark. Together, they left with nearly 50 others from St. Louis in 1804, the core of discovery. This slide notes various aspects of their journey, including the importance of Sacagawea in helping them navigate the wilderness. Jefferson's first term as president was a productive one. He had developed the Navy, more than doubled the size of the country, and thus in 1804 he was once again elected president. But his second term would be compromised as far as achievement by foreign affairs and the Embargo Act. Jefferson's problems were rooted in the conflict between France and England. These two nations sought to dominate Europe, and both countries had fought each other to a standstill. In 1805, Napoleon defeated the Russian and Austrian forces at Austerlitz, thus giving him domination over the land of Europe. In the same year, however, the British defeated both the French and Spanish fleets at the Battle of Trafalgar, thus becoming the dominating sea power in Europe. As a result, neither country could claim total and complete victory. Although not often studied, certainly not in our basic education in the U.S., the Napoleon Bonaparte and the Napoleonic Wars in Europe are a significant topic for European historical studies. From Spain to England to Russia, from the music of Beethoven to the novel War and Peace. These European conflicts were the greater Eastern theater of the general conflict that included the War of 1812 on this continent. Napoleon arose as one of France's notable generals during the French Revolution, who quelled the chaos produced therein and established the rule of a consulate. Eventually, he crowned himself emperor and exacerbated war with other European powers. Throughout this time, American shippers dominated Western European trade and had come to rely on the wealth they obtained from it. This slide notes how Britain began to exercise even more power on the seas as they controlled the seas. As the tension increased, eventually, as American vessels continued their way around British waters, however, the British began to reinstitute the old practice known as impressment. The British would take the American sailors and treat them as if they were British and not recognize their American status. And this slide notes what happened with the American vessel Chesapeake and the British vessel known as the Leopard. The Chesapeake incident enraged many war hawks in the U.S. who argued that America should go to war. Jefferson, however, was resolved not to get entangled in foreign affairs, and like Adams, attempted to deal with the issue diplomatically. As a result, Jefferson passed the Embargo Act, forbidding all trade with Europe and barring all American vessels from traveling into Europe. In other words, Jefferson was just trying to take U.S. ships out of the game. Well, that's going to have very negative results. From the outset, the embargo was unpopular. Most people were not willing to make the necessary sacrifices. Furthermore, the act was difficult to enforce, and people found too many loopholes and engaged in illegal trade. People's livelihoods were at stake here in the U.S. This was really, in a way, to avoid conflict, created a hardship for people in the U.S. Those who suffered the most were Southern farmers who, as a result, had no markets to send their grain, cotton, and tobacco. After 15 months, Jefferson repealed the act shortly before he left the office of president. And thus, James Madison became president of the United States. He was elected. Like Jefferson, he was from Virginia. And like Jefferson's second term, Madison's entire presidency would be dominated by foreign affairs and war. To address the problem with the British Navy, Madison attempted to correct it diplomatically, and thus, with the approval of Congress, set forth the Non-Intercourse Act. The next two slides give some biographical information on James Madison. Recognizing the devastation caused via the Embargo Act under Jefferson, which halted all trading with Europe, the Non-Intercourse Act reopened trade with all of Europe except for France and Britain. And although by June 16th of 1812 the British had withdrawn their restrictions, Madison had already asked Congress more than 2 weeks before for a declaration of war. Though Congress passed a declaration of war, the vote was split. On one hand, you had Southern farmers who found themselves without markets to sell their crops and saw war as the only means by which those markets could be reopened. It is important to note we're starting to see a real split between the North and the South in the U.S. And in this case here, the South wants war with Britain. On the other hand, though, it was the maritime states such as New York and New England, which, while bearing the brunt of British attacks on the seas, still made profits despite British restrictions, so they weren't for war. Nonetheless, war hawks, such as Speaker of the House Henry Clay and John C. Calhoun, got their war, a war for which they were unprepared. The United States was ill-prepared for war in a number of ways. For instance, where the money was going to come from. This slide covers aspects of that fact. Militarily speaking, the U.S. had a standing army of only 6,700 ill-trained and ill-equipped men, with veterans from the Revolutionary War to lead them, and a young General Winfield Scott made a comment on the status of the military leaders. The only positive thing the U.S. had was well-manufactured ships, but they only had 16 of them. And within 1 year of the war, the British had bottled up most of that fleet in harbor thanks to a blockade. Thus ensued the War of 1812, and this slide notes the northern Canadian aspect of it. But eventually, the Americans were victorious, especially under the leadership of Oliver Perry, who forced the British to surrender. And for a long time in U.S. history, Perry was a celebrated American hero. You don't hear much of him today. And while things were beginning to look good for the Americans in the war, in July and August of 1814, the British landed at Benedict, Maryland, some 40 miles away from Washington. And when the two forces met, known as the Battle of Bladensburg, the British regulars quickly defeated the Americans, who only had 7,000 militiamen. And thus, with little resistance, the British were able to march on the capital, Washington, and enter the president's mansion. Eventually, the Capitol building, the president's mansion, and other buildings were set on fire. Washington was partly destroyed. The war came to an end very late in 1814 with the signing of the Treaty of Ghent in Europe. But the Americans fought the British one last time in September to protect Fort McHenry. The Americans were victorious at this battle, and it was from this battle that America received its national anthem, which you have an assignment on this week. After the Battle of Baltimore and the Treaty of Ghent, news traveled slowly, and America fought the Battle of New Orleans against the British. A battle which produced a great deal of national pride and made Old Hickory, Andrew Jackson, a national icon. As Rourke notes, the War of 1812 also involved ongoing conflict with certain Native Americans inspired by Shawnee Chief Tecumseh, who allied themselves with the British. Here is a little timetable for the War of 1812. Famous is William Henry Harrison and Oliver Perry and Andrew Jackson. Note, at December 1814, Treaty of Ghent ends the American-British conflict known as the War of 1812. The American negotiators were Henry Clay, John Quincy Adams, and Albert Gallatin emerging as the most notable of the negotiators. And then finally, the victory at the Battle of New Orleans after the treaty had already been signed. During this period of Jefferson's first administration, something very important happened out on the frontier, focusing on an area known as Cane Ridge, Kentucky, in 1801. A revival of Christian piety broke out at one of the traditional quarterly frontier religious gatherings, and it is estimated anywhere from 10,000 to 25,000 were present at this particular gathering, with various Protestant denominations involved. And what started in 1801 is now known as the Second Great Awakening. Very famous is Charles Finney among the evangelists, and he established what today we now know as the altar call. And the revival service of worship, the order of music and then message, slowly begins to replace traditional liturgical worship patterns in the United States.